I did not marry her for conversation. The Duke of Blackwood, Alistair Beaumont, let the words fall into the smoky air of his club like discarded cigar ash. They were meant for Lord Harrington, a man whose own wit was as thin as his hair, but several others heard. They chuckled, a low rumble of masculine affirmation. It was a known thing. One married for lineage, for land, for an heir. One married for a quiet and well-managed home. Conversation was a luxury, a frivolity one sought elsewhere. Alistair took a slow sip of his brandy, the warmth doing little to touch the core of ice that was his ducal duty. He had done his duty. He had surveyed the available season's offerings with the dispassionate eye of a man buying prize cattle. He required unimpeachable bloodlines, a placid temperament, and an absence of scandal. He had found all three in Miss Eleanor Vance. She was the daughter of a minor, land-poor baron, a woman whose beauty was of such a subtle and unassuming quality that it took 3 meetings for him to properly register it. She was pale and quiet, with eyes the color of a winter sky and a habit of looking at her hands when addressed directly. Perfect. She would be an unobtrusive duchess. She would manage Blackwood Manor with quiet competence, produce the necessary air, and not trouble him with opinions or demands. She would be a placid and decorative fixture in his well-ordered life. He had been married for 2 months, and his assessment had, thus far, proven entirely correct. She was precisely what he had purchased. The word purchased flickered through his mind, unbidden and slightly distasteful, but he quashed it. It was an arrangement, a contract of mutual benefit. She received a title and security beyond her wildest dreams. He received a womb and a household manager. It was a fair exchange. Harrington, emboldened by the brandy and the Duke's confidence, leaned closer. "She is a bit of a mouse, isn't she? Saw her at the Danbury ball. Barely said 2 words all evening." Alistair did not deign to respond. It was one thing for him to state a fact about his own marriage. It was another entirely for a popinjay like Harrington to comment on his duchess. He merely gave a cool, dismissive glance that sent Harrington sputtering back into his seat. The conversation moved on to horses and politics, and the Duchess of Blackwood was forgotten, a mere footnote in the business of being a duke. Eleanor, now Duchess of Blackwood, stood in the long gallery, her fingers tracing the gilded frame of a portrait of Alistair's great-grandmother. The woman in the painting stared back with eyes as coolly intelligent as her own. She had been a scholar, a botanist of some repute, a fact a cursory glance at the estate library had revealed to Eleanor in her first week, a fact her husband had never mentioned. She had not set out to be a mouse. In her own home, a place of genteel poverty and loud, loving arguments, she had been known for a wit as quick as it was dry. She had devoured books, debated philosophy with her father, and managed their crumbling estates accounts with a mind for figures that was startlingly acute. But the world outside those worn walls had no place for a clever, penniless woman. So she had learned to be quiet. She had learned to be still. She had learned that survival, for a woman like her, was a performance of invisibility. She had understood the terms of her marriage perfectly. She was not a fool. She had seen the way Alistair looked at her, a calm, assessing gaze that catalogued her assets and liabilities. She was a transaction, and she had accepted her side of the bargain with open eyes. What she had not been prepared for was the profound, aching loneliness of his magnificent, silent house. He was not unkind. He was impeccably polite, a model of aristocratic courtesy. He held doors, pulled out her chair, and inquired after her health each morning with the same detached interest he might show a favored mare. But he did not see her. He looked at her. His gaze would rest upon her face, but his eyes were vacant of recognition. He saw the Duchess of Blackwood, the vessel for his heir, the mistress of his home. He did not see Eleanor Vance. She was present, and she was absent. She was there, and she was not there. For the first 2 months, she had tried, in her quiet way, to bridge the chasm between them. She had organized the chaotic estate ledgers, a task that had vexed his steward for years, and left the neatly bound summary on his desk. He had thanked her for her diligence and said no more. She had found a first edition of Seneca in the library, a volume he had been searching for, and placed it by his evening brandy. He had given a nod of acknowledgement, his eyes already scanning the first page. She began to play the pianoforte in the evenings, filling the cavernous drawing room with the melancholy beauty of Chopin. Sometimes he would look up from his papers, a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise, perhaps annoyance, before returning to his work. The music was for herself, a small act of reclamation in a life that felt increasingly like it belonged to someone else. Her efforts were small, ripples on the surface of a vast, still lake. They disturbed nothing. They changed nothing. He remained distant, a planet in a fixed and solitary orbit. The Duke returned late from his club. The house was silent, as it always was. He walked through the marble entryway, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. A single lamp was lit in the drawing room. He expected to find it empty, but she was there, curled in a large armchair by the fire, a book lying open in her lap. She had fallen asleep. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly look at her without the weight of public scrutiny or formal obligation. The firelight softened the austere lines of her face, catching the reddish glints in her dark brown hair. Her lashes cast long shadows on her cheeks. She looked younger, more vulnerable than the poised, placid duchess he presented to the world. A faint line of worry was etched between her brows, even in sleep. He felt a strange, unwelcome stirring in his chest. It was not desire, not precisely. It was something quieter, more complex. It was the disquieting recognition of a person, a complete and separate entity, existing within the shell of the wife he had acquired. He had a sudden, absurd impulse to pull the cashmere throw from the nearby settee and cover her with it. He did not. He turned and went up to his own chambers, the silence of the house following him like a shadow. The next day, Lord Harrington called. It was an unwelcome intrusion. Alistair received him in his study, the epitome of cool civility. As Harrington prattled on about some inconsequential matter, the study door, which had been left slightly ajar, swung silently wider. Alistair glanced up and saw his wife. She was passing in the hall, her arms full of linens she was taking to the West Wing guest rooms, a task she had taken upon herself. She paused for a fraction of a second, her gaze meeting his. He saw that she had heard. He knew it with an absolute, gut-wrenching certainty. He saw it in the sudden stillness of her body, in the way the faint color drained from her cheeks, and in the flicker of something deep and ancient in her eyes. A pain so swift and profound, it was gone before he could name it. Harrington, oblivious, chose that exact moment to laugh and say, "Still, Blackwood, you were right. A man in your position has no need for a chattering magpie. A quiet wife is a blessing." Eleanor did not flinch. She did not gasp. Her expression remained serene, a perfect mask of polite indifference. She simply inclined her head in a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, turned, and continued down the hall, her footsteps making no sound on the thick runner. A door had closed. Not a physical door, not one of wood and brass, but a door of the soul. He heard it click shut with a finality that echoed in the sudden, oppressive silence of the room. Harrington was still talking, but Alistair could no longer hear the words. He was watching the empty space in the hallway where his wife had been, a cold dread coiling in his stomach. He had made a mistake, a significant, perhaps irreparable mistake. The change was almost imperceptible at first. To an outside observer, nothing was different. The Duchess of Blackwood remained the epitome of grace and quiet dignity. The household continued to run with flawless precision. Meals were served on time. The linens were fresh, the silver polished. She was the perfect Duchess, the unobtrusive Duchess, the Duchess he had wanted. But he was not an outside observer. He was the man who lived in the house with her, and he began to feel her absence as a physical presence. The first thing he noticed was the silence. It was no longer the peaceful, orderly quiet of a well-managed estate. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness. The pianoforte in the drawing room remained closed. Its polished lid reflected the light from the tall windows, but it was a dead thing, a sarcophagus of music. He found himself waiting for the sound of Chopin in the evenings, a sound he had barely registered before, and its absence was a hollow ache in the pit of his stomach. Then came the dinners. They had always been quiet affairs, punctuated by the clinking of cutlery and his own perfunctory questions about her day. Now they were voids. She answered his questions with a single, polite word. Yes. No. Adequate. She never initiated a topic. She never lifted her eyes from her plate. She ate with a slow, deliberate grace, a perfect automaton of etiquette. He was dining with a beautiful, exquisitely dressed ghost. He began to talk, to fill the void. He spoke of estate matters, of politics, of the weather. He spoke of anything and everything, the sound of his own voice seeming unnaturally loud in the vast dining room. She would listen, her expression one of placid attention, but she would not engage. She would nod, a small, polite inclination of her head, but she offered no opinion, no thought, no flicker of the person within. He had said he did not marry her for conversation, and she had taken him at his word. She had given him exactly what he deserved. He thought about the ledgers, the neat, precise columns of figures, the insightful notes in the margins that had saved the estate a considerable sum. That was not the work of a mouse. He thought about the first edition of Seneca. How had she known he was looking for it? He had mentioned it once, in passing, to his secretary, months before their marriage. She must have listened, filed the information away, and remembered. A mouse did not remember such things. He started watching her, not just looking at her, but truly watching. He observed the way she spoke to the staff, with a quiet kindness and a deep, genuine interest in their lives. He saw Mrs. Davies, the stern, unsmiling housekeeper, actually smile while speaking with the Duchess in the gardens. He saw a young footman, who had dropped a tray of glasses, look at her with utter relief and gratitude when she had dismissed the incident with a calm word and a reassuring gesture. She was the heart of his home, and he had not even noticed. He had been living in the house, but he had not been present in it. He had treated her as a part of the architecture, a valuable but inanimate object. One afternoon, he found her in the library. It was a space he considered his own, yet she was there more often than he was. She was not reading. She was standing on a ladder, her back to him. carefully dusting the spines of the books on the highest shelf. She was humming, a soft, tuneless sound. It was the first sound he had heard from her in weeks that was not a polite, monosyllabic response. The humming stopped the moment she sensed his presence. She turned, her body stiffening. The serene, placid mask fell into place. "Your Grace, I did not realize you were here. I was just ensuring the books were properly cared for." "It is your library as much as mine, Eleanor," he said, the sound of her given name feeling foreign on his tongue. "Of course, Your Grace," she replied, her voice perfectly even. She made to descend the ladder. "What were you humming?" The question was impulsive, clumsy. She paused, her hand on the wooden frame of the ladder. For a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise, confusion. Then it was gone. "I do not recall, Your Grace." She descended, smoothed her skirts, and walked out of the library, leaving him alone with the scent of old paper and lemon polish, and the echoing silence of a song half sung. The realization was not a sudden flash of lightning. It was a slow, creeping dawn, a painful illumination of his own profound stupidity. It was an accumulation of clues. The empty chair by the fire where she used to read, the untouched copies of the London papers on her side of the breakfast table, the way his valet, a man who had been with him since boyhood, now looked at him with an expression of faint, pitying disapproval. The catalyst came, as it so often does, from an unexpected quarter. It came from Mr. Fletcher, the butler, a man so seamlessly integrated into the fabric of the house that Alistair often forgot he was there. Fletcher was decanting the port after another silent, agonizing dinner. Alistair sat alone at the long, polished table, staring at his wife's empty chair. She had retired immediately after the meal, pleading a headache. She had been pleading a headache for a fortnight. "Will there be anything else, Your Grace?" Fletcher asked, his voice as dry as the old port. "No, Fletcher. That will be all." Fletcher did not move. He stood by the sideboard, his hands clasped behind his back. This deviation from his routine was so unusual that it commanded Alistair's attention. "Fletcher, forgive me, Your Grace. An observation, if I may." "Proceed." "Her Grace has been overseeing the replanting of the West Terrace garden," Fletcher said, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over Alistair's left shoulder. "The one that has been neglected since your grandmother's time." Alistair frowned. He knew of the garden, a tangled mess of weeds and thorns. "And?" "Her Grace has a remarkable knowledge of botany. She has been corresponding with the Royal Gardens at Kew. She has sourced several rare rose cuttings. She says she wishes to restore the Duchess Beatrice's garden to its former state." Duchess Beatrice, the scholar, the botanist, the woman in the portrait. "She works out there for several hours each day, Your Grace," Fletcher continued, his voice still devoid of inflection. "Even when the weather is inclement. She says the quiet helps with her headaches." The words hung in the air. "The quiet helps with her headaches." It was a message, a carefully delivered piece of intelligence from a loyal servant who saw more than he ever let on. Fletcher was not just talking about the garden. He was talking about the house. He was talking about the marriage. Fletcher gave a slight bow. "The port is a 1798, an excellent year. Good evening, Your Grace." He retreated from the room, as silent as a wraith. Alistair sat alone in the vast, empty room, the butler's words replaying in his mind. She says the quiet helps with her headaches. The savage, unintentional irony of it struck him like a physical blow. He had created this quiet. He had demanded it, celebrated it, and now he was choking on it. And she, in her infinite, maddening resilience, had found a way to make a life for herself within it. She had retreated to a ruined garden, a place of thorns and neglect, and was coaxing it back to life, alone. The epiphany arrived then, a blinding, searing light in the darkness of his ignorance. He remembered the day. He remembered Harrington's smirking face. He remembered the flicker of pain in his wife's eyes in the hallway. He remembered the soft, final click of the closing door. He had taken a vibrant, intelligent, witty woman and tried to turn her into a decorative object. He had not broken her spirit. He had simply given it cause to retreat so far inside herself that he could no longer reach it. He had looked at a masterpiece and seen only the frame. He thought of his crass pronouncement at the club. I did not marry her for conversation. He had been wrong. He had been a fool. He had been blind. He rose from the table, the glass of port forgotten. He knew where he had to go. He found her, just as Fletcher had implied he would, in the dilapidated remains of the West Terrace garden. A pale, watery moon cast long, skeletal shadows from the overgrown yew trees. A cold mist was rising from the damp earth. She was on her knees in the dirt, a small trowel in her hand, tending to a patch of newly turned soil where a few fragile-looking rose cuttings were planted. She wore a thick wool cloak over her dress, but he could see that she was shivering. She did not seem to hear him approach. She was utterly absorbed in her task, her focus absolute. He stood there for a long moment, watching her. This was her sanctuary. This was the space she had carved out for herself in the wreckage of his carelessness. Eleanor, he said, his voice quiet. She started, her head snapping up. In the moonlight, her face was pale and drawn, her eyes wide with alarm. The serene mask was gone. Here, in her private world, she was unguarded. He saw the weariness in her, the deep, settled sadness. Your Grace, she said, her voice barely a whisper. She scrambled to her feet, brushing the dirt from her hands. I could not sleep. He took a step closer. You should not be out here. It is cold. I am well enough, she replied, pulling the cloak tighter around herself. Her tone was dismissive, final. She was already retreating, the walls going up. No, he said, the word sharp, cutting through the cold air. You are not, and it is my fault. She stared at him, her expression unreadable. She said nothing. Her silence was a judgment, more powerful than any shouted accusation. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not offer excuses. He owed her the truth, brutal and unadorned. I was in my study, he began, his voice low and steady. The day Lord Harrington called. The door was ajar. You were in the hall. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. He saw the faintest tremor in her hand as she clutched her cloak. You heard what I said to him at the club, he continued, forcing himself to meet her gaze. The day before. You must have overheard him repeat it. He paused, the memory of his own arrogant words tasting like ash in his mouth. He said I had told him I did not marry you for conversation. She remained perfectly still, a statue carved from moonlight and sorrow. It was the cruelest, most foolish thing I have ever said, he said, the admission costing him more than he could have imagined. It was a lie, born of arrogance and a profound, willful blindness. He took another step, closing the distance between them. I was wrong, Eleanor. About everything. I was wrong. He saw a single tear trace a path down her cheek, glittering like a diamond in the moonlight before she hastily brushed it away. "I spent 2 months living in the same house as you, and I never saw you at all," he confessed, the words raw, torn from a place of deep, newfound shame. "I saw a duchess. I saw a wife. I saw a solution to the problem of my succession. I did not see the woman who balanced the estate ledgers in 3 days. I did not see the woman who knew I was searching for a rare book. I did not see the woman who could bring a dead garden back to life." He gestured to the nascent rosebed at their feet. "I did not see you." He stopped, his confession hanging in the cold, damp air. He had said all he could. The rest was up to her. He waited, his heart pounding in his chest, for her verdict. She looked from his face to the small, hopeful-looking plants in the dark soil. For a long time, she said nothing. The silence stretched, filled only by the sighing of the wind through the overgrown yews. He felt a despair so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. He had destroyed it. He had taken this precious, unexpected thing and crushed it with his careless pride. Then she spoke, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. "They are Gallica roses," she said, her gaze still fixed on the cuttings. "Officinalis, the apothecary's rose, one of the oldest cultivars in existence. Your great-grandmother wrote of them in her journals. She said they were remarkably resilient." She finally lifted her eyes to his. They were clear, the winter sky gray of them, holding not anger, but a deep, fathomless exhaustion. And something else, a question. "Resilience is not infinite, Your Grace," she said softly. He knew then that this was not the end. It was the beginning of a negotiation, a long and arduous process of atonement. She was not granting him pardon. She was setting the terms. The next day, Lord Harrington was informed by a curt note from the Duke's secretary that he was no longer welcome at Blackwood Manor or any of the Duke's London residences. The cut was swift, public, and brutal. Society buzzed with it for a week. Alistair did not care. It was the first and easiest step. The harder work began at home. He did not expect an immediate thaw. He knew he had not earned it. The quiet in the house remained, but its quality began to change. It was no longer a suffocating absence, but a watchful, waiting space. He began to fill it, not with the panicked monologue of before, but with genuine attempts at connection. He started joining her in the garden. He did not offer clumsy help. He simply brought her a cup of tea in the morning or a shawl when the evening chill set in. He would sit on the cold stone bench and watch her work, asking quiet questions about the plants, about her plans for the restoration. "This one is a damask," she explained one afternoon, her fingers gently tending to another new cutting. "Your great-grandmother believed it was brought to these shores by a returning crusader. Its scent is strongest at dawn and dusk." "Tell me about her," he said. "About Duchess Beatrice." Eleanor looked up, surprised. She hesitated, then began to speak of the woman she had come to know through journals and letters, a woman of science and passion, trapped in a world that had no room for her intellect. As she spoke, a flicker of the woman she had been before, the animated, intelligent woman from a loud, loving home, began to emerge. He listened, rapt, not just to the words, but to the cadence of her voice, the subtle shift in her expression as she spoke of something that truly mattered to her. He started talking to her. He did not just talk at her. He talked to her. He asked her opinion on everything. He brought the estate ledgers to her, not as a completed task for her to admire, but as a problem for them to solve together. He spread the maps of the tenant farms on the library table and asked for her insights. Section. The soil in the North Fields is too acidic for barley, she observed after a moment's study. It is why the yields have been so poor. But it would be perfect for potatoes. Your great-grandmother's journals mention a similar issue on the home farm. He stared at her, astounded. His steward, a man who had managed the lands for 30 years, had missed it. He implemented her suggestion. The next harvest was the best the North Fields had produced in a generation. He made sure every tenant farmer knew the success was due to the Duchess's insight. Slowly, cautiously, she began to talk back. The conversations were halting at first, focused on impersonal subjects, gardens, books, estate management. But gradually, they deepened. He discovered her dry, surprising wit. He learned of her passion for history, her sharp political mind, her unexpectedly pragmatic view of the world. He learned that the mouse Harrington had mocked possessed a lion's heart and a scholar's intellect. One evening, he came into the drawing room to find her sitting at the pianoforte. She was not playing, just resting her fingers on the silent keys. He stood in the doorway, his heart in his throat. He said nothing, afraid to break the spell. She looked over at him. "I have forgotten how," she said, her voice soft. "I do not believe that," he replied, walking towards her. "I believe you chose not to remember." He sat beside her on the bench. "Play for me, Eleanor," he said, not as a command, but as a plea. "Please." Her fingers hovered over the ivory keys for a long moment. Then she began to play. It was not Chopin. It was a simple, haunting folk melody, a song full of longing and quiet sorrow. The music filled the room, breaking the long silence, washing away the last of the suffocating stillness. It was a lament, but it was also a beginning. He did not try to touch her. He simply sat beside her, listening, as the music spoke the words they could not yet say. He had married her for silence, and now the most beautiful sound in the world was the one her hands were making. The rebuilding was a slow, deliberate construction. It was built of small moments, of shared glances over the breakfast table, of books left open to a passage one thought the other might enjoy. It was built of laughter, a sound so rare at first that it startled them both. It was built of his relentless, unwavering attention. He had learned to see, and now he could not look away. He learned the small things that composed the whole of her. He learned she preferred tea to coffee, autumn to spring, history to novels. He learned she had a small, secret smile that appeared only when she was truly amused. He learned she had a fierce sense of justice, a deep compassion for those less fortunate, and an abiding loathing for marzipan. He, in turn, began to reveal himself to her. He spoke of the crushing weight of the dukedom he had inherited at a young age, of the loneliness of his position, of his fear of failing the long line of ancestors who stared down at him from the walls. He confessed that his cold, logical approach to the world was a shield, a defense against the chaos of emotion he did not know how to navigate. "You built a fortress," she said to him one evening as they sat before the fire in the library, "and you forgot to build a door." "You are the door," he replied, the truth of it hitting him with the force of a revelation. The external world, which had faded into the background, intruded in the form of a letter. A distant cousin of Alistair's, a man with a reputation for sharp practice and a festering resentment over a long-settled inheritance dispute, was challenging the Blackwood title to a crucial parcel of land that bordered his own. The claim was tenuous, based on an obscure bit of heraldic law, but the man was litigious and stubborn. It threatened to become a costly, draining legal battle. Alistair's solicitors were pessimistic. The case would hinge on a marriage contract from the early 16th century, a document that had been lost for over 100 years. Without it, the cousin's claim, while weak, might hold up in a sympathetic court. Alistair was consumed with worry, spending days locked in the archives with his legal team, searching for any scrap of evidence that might help their case. Eleanor watched him grow more strained, more withdrawn. The old Duke, the one who retreated into cold silence, threatened to re-emerge. One night, he was working late in the study, a mountain of deeds and charters spread across his desk, when she came in, carrying a tray with a pot of tea and a plate of biscuits. "You will work yourself into an illness," she said, her voice gentle. "I have to find it," he said, rubbing his temples. "It is the only way." She poured him a cup of tea. "Tell me about the contract," she said. "Tell me everything you know." He explained the convoluted history, the names of the bride and groom from centuries past, the lands in question. He spoke for nearly an hour, laying out the frustrating, impossible puzzle. She listened, her full attention on him, asking a sharp, clarifying question now and then. When he was finished, she was silent for a moment. "Lady Isabel," she said, thoughtfully. "The bride. She was a Beaumont before her marriage, was she not? A cousin to the main line." "Yes," he said, surprised she had retained the detail. "That is the crux of the legal argument." "And she was known for her piety," Eleanor continued, almost to herself. "She endowed a local chantry chapel upon her marriage." He frowned. "Yes, but the chapel was dissolved 2 generations later. The records are gone." "Perhaps not all of them," she said. She stood up. "Come with me." She led him not to the archives, but to the library, to the section on theology and church history. She pulled down a heavy, leather-bound volume, a history of the local parishes, compiled by a Victorian-era vicar. It was a book he had passed 1,000 times and never opened. Eleanor turned the fragile pages with a careful hand until she found the chapter on the dissolved chantry. Most of it was a dry recitation of dates and names. But in a footnote, the vicar had transcribed a portion of the chapel's inventory, taken at the time of its dissolution. The list included chalices, vestments, and other ecclesiastical items. And at the very bottom of the list was an entry that made Alistair's breath catch in his throat. Item: 1 traveling scriptorium of Spanish leather, containing the marriage articles of Lady Isabel Beaumont, gifted to the safekeeping of God and St. Giles. The inventory notes that all valuables were removed to the main abbey, Eleanor said, her voice calm, though her eyes were shining. But the scriptorium, containing only paper, was likely deemed of no value. It would have been stored with the abbey's other legal documents. The next day, Alistair and his solicitor were at the local abbey, whose archives were famously disorganized. But knowing what to look for, they found it within an hour, a small, decaying leather box at the bottom of a dusty crate. Inside, perfectly preserved, was the lost marriage contract. The cousin's claim evaporated overnight. That evening, Alistair found Eleanor in the West Terrace garden. It was late summer, and the space was transformed. It was no longer a place of thorns and neglect, but a riot of color and scent. The Gallica roses, the damasks, and a dozen other varieties bloomed in fragrant profusion. It was a testament to her care, her patience, her resilience. He stood before her, the setting sun turning the sky to gold and rose. "You saved us," he said simply. "Your mind, Eleanor, your incredible mind. You saw the connection no one else could." "I read the books," she said with a small shrug. "I pay attention." "I know," he said softly. He reached out and took her hands. They were no longer the pale, soft hands of a lady of leisure. They were calloused and slightly stained with earth. They were the most beautiful hands he had ever seen. "I have a confession to make," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "A final one." She waited, her gaze steady on his. "That day, at my club," he said, "when I said what I said, I did not believe it even then. I think perhaps I said it because I was afraid." "Afraid? Afraid of you," he admitted. "Afraid of the conversation I knew, deep down, we were meant to have. The kind that changes everything. It was easier to pretend I wanted silence." He lifted her hand to his lips. "I cannot imagine a life without your voice, Eleanor. I cannot imagine a day without our conversation. It is the thing I value most in this world." He looked into her winter sky eyes and saw the last of the frost melt away. He saw the door, the one that had closed so quietly all those months ago, finally swing open. "Alistair," she said, and the sound of his name, spoken with such unguarded tenderness, was all the answer he needed. A year later, the Duke of Blackwood was a changed man. The cold, aloof aristocrat was gone, replaced by a man who laughed easily and often, a man whose eyes constantly sought out his wife. The house, once a monument to silent order, was now filled with life. The sounds of music, of debate, of shared laughter echoed in the halls. They were in the garden, the restored, magnificent garden, walking hand in hand. A small, robustly healthy baby with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes slept soundly in a pram nearby. The heir had been produced, but it was an act of love and joy, not a fulfillment of a contract. Eleanor paused to admire a particularly vibrant yellow rose. "Duchess Beatrice would be pleased," she said. "This is a new hybrid. I have been corresponding with a botanist in France." Alistair smiled, watching her. He loved to watch her, to listen to her. He had discovered that his wife, the woman he had once dismissed as a quiet mouse, had an opinion on everything from Napoleonic strategy to the proper cultivation of asparagus. Their conversations were endless, veering from the profound to the ridiculous, and he cherished every word. "I received a letter from your aunt this morning," he said, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "She is coming to visit for the christening. She seems to think I am a tolerable husband after all." Eleanor's secret smile appeared. "I may have mentioned that you are trainable." He laughed, a full, genuine sound. He pulled her closer, his arm around her waist. "Eleanor Beaumont," he said, his voice low and full of a deep, abiding contentment. "You have ruined me for silence." "I know," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder as they looked at their sleeping son. "It was my plan all along." He looked at his wife, truly saw her. This brilliant, resilient, extraordinary woman who had saved him from himself. He saw the love in her eyes, a reflection of his own. The man who had not married for conversation had discovered it was the very air he needed to breathe. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would spend the rest of his life listening. He would never stop talking to her. He would never stop learning her. Their conversation had just begun. If you made it to the end of Alistair and Eleanor's story, thank you for listening. Tell me in the comments, what was the one small detail Alistair noticed that you think truly turned the tide for him? I love reading your thoughts. In our next story, a reclusive botanist, a desperate debutante, and a collection of deadly nightshades prove that love can bloom in the most poisonous of places. If you enjoyed their journey from silence to conversation, please consider liking and subscribing for more. They arrive here whenever they are ready.